So to make the frames, you start with a stack of lumber like this, and it's 4/4 stock, and which is roughly finished, roughly 3/4 of an inch thick. Could be a little less, maybe a little more. And then also you have, so that's the frame members, and then the gussets and the floor timbers are made out of plywood. And so you start with that, and then you take the full-size patterns and you trace the frame members on the lumber itself. And so what you want to do is just have a nice center line that you can reference the frame patterns to, and the way these patterns are, you only get half, so you have to basically what you do is you would draw on the layout board. You would use carbon paper so you can draw the frame layout on the layout board, but use carbon paper that's both facing down, so as you trace it with a wheel, it makes the pattern on the layout board, and then you have one piece facing up, so then you get the mirror image of the pattern on the back side of these full-size patterns, because you only get half the frames on the patterns. And I talk about that a little bit later in this video also when you're doing on a layout board. So you draw them on the board like this on your lumber, and here you can see this is the bottom frame member, one of the frames. Now I picked lumber that was wide enough so I could have one lumber piece for both halves of the bottom of each frame as much as I could. You don't actually have to do that because the floor timber holds it strong enough, but that is what I did. But again, you don't have to do that. And then here I'm just showing how you can see that V of those bottom frame members on the layout board, and I draw a center line here up through the center of the board, and then here you can see the layout of the floor timber itself also. And then here's cut out pieces of frame members for 4 of the frames. You can see the bottom members of those and the side members. And then what you do also is use the full-size patterns, and you of course trace the gussets right out on your plywood, and you cut them out. And what I do is I cut them with a jigsaw, but I don't cut right after the line. I cut close, and then I use my bench belt sander to get up closer to the line. And the floor timber, you do the same thing for the floor timbers. I just don't have a picture of that here. So here's a video that talks a little bit about how I made the frames for my Monaco. And so I used a layout board, and I bought a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and then I think it was 3/4 ply or roughly there, and cut it down so it wasn't quite so big. And then what I do is I draw a center line across the board here. You don't see it in this picture. On the next one you'll see it. And then I trace the patterns on the board, the full-size frame patterns. Now this pattern is actually upside down. When you flip it over, the patterns come, you only have half of the frame, so you have to trace one half and then flip it over on the center line and then trace the other half. So what I did is I bought some large carbon paper, and then so when you trace the first, when you're tracing, I don't have a picture of this, the other side of the frame, you put the carbon paper so it traces onto the board, and then you have another piece that's pointing up, so you have 2 of them. And so you basically get a mirror image on the back side of the frame, and you can see that's what this is showing here. And I use a pattern tracing wheel that you can get at any kind of a sewing type shop. And I clamp the patterns down to the board so they don't move around as you're tracing. And then I don't show it here, but I would clamp it down on this end, kind of stretch it so it was tight, not too tight, and then trace the patterns that way. And so I used the same board for all 8 frames for the Monaco. I think 4 of them where the bottom of the frame was on this side and the other 4 on the top side, just because you get too many lines in there. One thing to note is what I do is I cut little squares along the center line. You can see in the frames right in the pattern, so I can reference like the center line that's drawn on the board. That way I can locate this pattern, because when I have it flipped over on the other side, when you first trace one half of the frame, I make sure to center this reference line right on that center line on the board. And then what I also did is when I traced the floor timber, the top edge of the floor timber, for example, I cut little squares here, and so on the board, you don't see under here, but this whole frame pattern is traced on this side of the board, and that's when I cut these squares and referenced, so I could have it along that reference line there and along the center line. So then when I flip the pattern over like you see here, then I make sure and line up these squares on the center line, and then I also have these squares along this horizontal line, if you consider this vertical. That way you have two reference lines to locate the frames, so it makes your pattern symmetrical on the layout board. This next picture I show, you can see where I have multiple frames. They're different sizes, so you can get away with that, but 4 on this side and then 4 on the other. And one thing to note here is, so this frame I'm getting ready to epoxy, and notice these little nails. What I did is I drilled holes, and then I tacked the frame pieces down. That helps hold them, because these are pretty big to try to hold manually. And notice the plastic. You want to lay plastic down before you epoxy the gussets and the floor timbers, so you don't, of course, epoxy your frames to the board. And then so you lay these pieces flat and do the gussets and floor timbers on one side, and then once those are dry, you flip this whole assembly over, and then you've got to do the back side, the floor timber and the gussets. Actually, the floor timber, there's only one, but the gussets on the other side, you have to do that. What I'm doing here is before I epoxy, and one thing to note is I tack these pieces down, and I forgot to put plastic down, so I had to pull them up and actually lay plastic down. But what I was trying to do here is just checking some critical dimensions to make sure they were as close as possible. When you're doing this, the frame layout doesn't have to be perfect, but it's nice to make it close, because you're going to fair these frames anyway, these outer edges, later on in the build. So it's not like they have to be perfect, but as close as possible is good, just to save fairing later on. So here's another picture I'm showing where I'm checking another critical dimension from essentially a level line based on the floor timber, which is not shown in the picture. So I'm just checking that to make sure I'm in the ballpark, and also doing the same thing here from this level line up to this bottom part of this frame. So you don't have to do this, but it was just a way for me to kind of double check to make sure I was pretty close. And then here is a frame ready to epoxy. Notice the plastic is down, and so I pre-drilled the holes for the nails. I did use nails in the gussets per the plans, and then the floor timbers are screws, so I pre-drilled all those, and so it's ready to epoxy. So once you get it all set up, you put your epoxy down on the gusset or the gussets or the floor timber and the mating edges or mating surfaces, and then you just attach them. And having these frame pieces tacked down like this helps hold everything in place.